In today's gospel, we are told of the second pastoral visit of Jesus Christ to the region of the Decapolis. I don't expect you to necessarily call this immediately to mind, but we are presently in the 7th chapter of the gospel according to St. Mark, and in the 5th chapter is when we see his first pastoral visit. And I think once I begin to describe it, you'll recall it immediately. It is when Jesus Christ stepped foot on the shore of that region, he was immediately confronted by a man possessed by a demon. We are told that that demon's name was Legion, because there were many. And submitting themselves to the authority of Jesus Christ, and knowing that nothing but doom lay ahead of them, they begged that they at least be cast out into a nearby herd of swine. And so Jesus Christ concurred with that proposal, allowed them to do it, but with one caveat. That herd would barrel headlong down a hill, fling themselves in the sea, and drown. Now, when the people heard what had just taken place with regards to the swine, but then they saw the man possessed by a demon, now perfectly sound and perfectly sane, it was a bit much for them to take all at once. And we're told that they begged him to leave. Please go away. So he did. But as he was leaving, the man who was formerly possessed and had now been made whole asked the Lord if he could follow him, presumably in order to become his disciple. And this request the Lord did not grant. He said no. He goes, rather, I want you to go back into your territory and tell what God has done for you. And then the Lord, of course, departed. Now, we don't know how much time elapsed, but in today's gospel, Christ exits the proper territory of Israel to enter into pagan land, making a loop through the north over to the east, through Tyre and Sidon, back down into the area of the Decapolis. Now, something clearly has changed in the mind of the people there, because he seemed to get a positive reception on this occasion, didn't he? Almost as though they had time to process everything that had taken place and listen carefully to the testimony of the man who had formerly been possessed by Legion. And so he was welcomed. And more than welcome, they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a terrible speech impediment. And they asked him to please simply lay his hands upon him. And when he cured this man, the people responded, not go away, but rather they were marveling. And they said, this man does all things well. I think by any standard of measure, whatever the Lord was thinking, whatever the Lord was planning, was a success and was beginning to bear fruit. But let's get to the healing itself. This is a healing that is specific to the gospel according to St. Mark. It's not recorded in any of the other 3 gospels. And what is unique about this particular narrative is how explicit it is in its detail. Now, I kind of want to preface my next remarks by saying this isn't to say that on this occasion this is the only way Jesus healed this particular man, because the other Gospels don't go into a whole lot of glorified detail, so we don't really know the manner and the means by which Jesus cured most of the people, some, but not all. But it's worth noting the detail in this account. And the first thing that ought to strike you is how intensely sacramental this healing is. Intensely sacramental. Just by way of review, what's a sacrament in general? It's something visible that reveals that which is hidden from our sight or invisible. And so we say, the heavens declare the glory of God. You look at the heavens, what do they speak of? God's glory. That's sacrament in the broadest general sense of the word. What is a sacrament specifically, as we understand it as Roman Catholics? The seven. It is the visible sign instituted by Christ to give what? Something that cannot seen. Something that is hidden, something that is invisible. His grace. And so when I say that this is intensely sacramental, pay very close attention. Because what is Jesus Christ revealing about himself through his body? His body. Well, first he quite literally puts his fingers in the man's ear. And then he spits. Spits. And he put his spit on the man's tongue. Then with a gesture, he raises his eyes to heaven. Makes you think of that psalm, I lift up my eyes to the mountains and say, from where comes my help? My help shall come from heaven and from heaven. And then he groans. That word groan only appears one other time in the entire New Testament. And it's used by St. Paul to describe how the Holy Spirit intercedes for the faithful with groanings that cannot be expressed with words. So whatever it is that Jesus Christ wanted to say could not be expressed in human language, but only could be expressed with a deep groan of the throat. And then comes the word of command, Ephphatha, spoken with his tongue. And immediately the man received his hearing. And because he was able to hear, he was now able to speak plainly. When you look at how intensely sacramental this healing truly was, I would have to suggest that each and every one of us would be forcibly reminded, of the institution of the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. We just finished 5 weeks in a row of considering the 6th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. And while he may have told the crowds at that time, his former disciples, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, they being horrified because they took him quite literally, they understood him plainly, they left and would no longer follow him. But when we hear those words, it is a terrific comfort and consolation, because we have been given to understand. And so the Lord is able to say, quite clearly, quite plainly, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, you can have no life in you. Because it is the very body of the Lord, it is his flesh in all its humanity that is indissolubly united to his divine nature. And it is precisely through his body that he communicates his divine power and reveals his place as Son in the Blessed Trinity. When we look at how Jesus Christ reveals himself in a human body, we know that there is a certain sense in which we must understand Christ is also at the same time revealing something about us and how we are revealed in our own particular body. The great value, the great dignity of the human body. What is the body? Without a soul. But it is precisely through the body that the soul manifests itself, and we come to learn one another's personalities. We could look at, theoretically, a pure spirit without a body. But could you call a pure spirit, in the true sense of the word, a mother, if she had no body in which to bear a child in her womb and breasts with which to feed that same child? See, there's something of the love and the tenderness and the care of a woman who is a mother that requires a body. And the same is true when we want to speak about what is a man. What are the implications? Well, what I want to suggest to you, and it's more than a suggestion, I would probably go so far as to say it's pretty much a fact, but you have to kind of look into it and take your own deep dive. But let me preface what I'm about to say with, there's no such thing as a new heresy. We're just not that clever. Every heresy is an ancient heresy, and they simply get recycled generation after generation after generation and continually represent themselves under some form. But when you understand the heresy and recognize its form, you can spot it for what it is. And among other things, so many things, what is the heresy that is representing itself and plaguing our culture? Isn't it Gnosticism? What is Gnosticism? Well, at the risk of oversimplifying the matter, Gnosticism holds the body with great indifference, if not sometimes hatred. The body is absolutely inconsequential. What matters is the spirit trapped within that is struggling, striving, desperately craves to be set free from this prison, so that it can be what it is. And it is this kind of Gnosticism that is representing itself in the forms of, in the worst case scenario, like I said, outward hatred for the human body, and at bare minimum, indifference. And the fruits that it is producing are obvious, aren't they? We can look at something like pornography. What does that say about the human person and the dignity of those persons' bodies? We can look at different ways in which, to the extreme, people modify their bodies with piercings and tattoos. There's nothing wrong with having something pierced, like an ear or a discreet tattoo, but you can also go overboard, can't you? You can go overboard. Gender confusion and the mutilation, we're not going to call it a modification. When you modify things, you improve it. When you mutilate it, you destroy its former potential. Where does this confusion come from? And is it not from that same spirit of Gnosticism that plagued the first couple centuries of the church, that has continually represented itself, but now is so bold and so ugly and so out there that it cannot not be recognized for precisely what it is? But what's going on with an awful lot of Roman Catholics? A lot of Roman Catholics simply adopt or are persuaded to adopt the ways of the world, which is going to bring us back to the healing of the man who was deaf and was unable to speak. And I deliberately left this out to save it for the last. What's the first thing Jesus Christ did before he effected the cure? He separated him from the herd. Why? Well, that's where we get into the spiritual interpretation of today's gospel. There is the literal interpretation, the one I'd already presented, but there's also a spiritual interpretation. And what we're being told is the reason why the man was deaf is because he lived in the clamorous discord of the mob. He could not hear the voice of truth. And if you can't hear the truth, you certainly can't articulate it or speak it yourself. I think today we call it like groupthink. No way. Everyone racing to their computer to check Facebook to see what their opinion needs to be so they can get more likes. To put a fine point on it for some people. Because that does happen. And what we need to do is to separate ourselves from the herd. That doesn't mean being uninformed. It doesn't mean not knowing what is going on. But it certainly means not succumbing to the clamorous discord of the mob. And leaving that time each day in silence and solitude to allow Jesus Christ to speak to your heart and make sure your heart is ready and prepared to welcome him. So that hearing you may be able to speak and not be part of the clamorous discord. Look at Jesus Christ one last final time when we consider, the great dignity, of the human body and its sacramental implications, because I think that this has great bearing on why we're here this morning for the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. And this, of course, I do not need to tell those who are married something that they already know. That when a man and woman enter into the covenantal relationship of holy matrimony. They now belong to one another. And it is precisely through their bodies that they express their love and fidelity. As a free gift that is whole, that is entire, that is complete, that has no restrictions, no strings attached. It is open to the possibility of the generation of new human life. And that sacramentality they enjoy is so intense, the scriptures tell us that though they be two, they become, in reality, one flesh. And that this whole mystery of the covenantal relationship of the husband and wife, united in the bonds of holy matrimony, St. Paul calls a great sacrament. Because he says, it represents Christ's love for his church. And it is precisely that love that we come to celebrate, to witness, and to receive in our own bodies.